Sold as a slave, she was bought and protected by a feared and silent gunslinger. The dust swirled around the wooden platform in the center of Deadwood's main street, carrying with it the acrid smell of sweat, tobacco, and desperation. Margaret O'Brien stood with her wrists bound, her emerald eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd of leering faces. At 19, she had already endured more hardship than most would face in a lifetime. The death of her parents in a wagon train attack had left her vulnerable, and unscrupulous men had taken advantage of her situation, forcing her into a life she never chose. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty street. "What am I bid for this fine specimen, young, strong, and easy on the eyes, perfect for household work or other arrangements?" The crowd erupted in crude laughter and catcalls. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she refused to show fear. She had learned that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. $50, called out a fat merchant with gold teeth gleaming in the afternoon sun. 75, shouted a rancher known for his brutal treatment of workers. Margaret's heart pounded as the bids climbed higher. She had heard stories about what happened to women sold at these auctions, and none of them ended well. The hot September sun beat down mercilessly on her shoulders, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool breeze that occasionally swept through the canyon. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. $200. The crowd fell silent. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily stunned. Margaret looked toward the voice and saw a man unlike any she had ever encountered. He stood apart from the others, his black hat pulled low over his eyes, casting shadows across a face that seemed carved from stone. His long coat hung open, revealing the pearl handles of 2 Colt revolvers holstered at his sides. Everything about him radiated danger, from his measured stance to the way his eyes seemed to catalogue every person in the crowd as either threat or irrelevance. $200, the auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Do I hear 250? The crowd had gone from boisterous to dead silent. Margaret noticed how grown men seemed to shrink away from the stranger's presence. Even the merchant, who had been bidding aggressively, suddenly found great interest in his boots. "Going once, going twice." The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. "Sold to the gentleman in black." The stranger stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden planks. He counted out the money with deliberate precision, each bill crisp and clean. As he handed over the payment, his eyes met Margaret's for the first time. She expected to see the same predatory hunger she had grown accustomed to, but instead found something else entirely. His gaze was steady, almost calculating, but there was no malice in it. If anything, she detected a flicker of something that might have been compassion. "Come," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Margaret's hands were freed, and she rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed her skin. She followed him through the parting crowd, acutely aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. "That's Jake Morrison," she heard someone murmur. "They say he's killed more men than cholera." "Never seen him buy a woman before," another voice replied. "Usually just rides through town like a ghost." Margaret's legs felt unsteady as they walked toward the edge of town, where a magnificent black stallion waited, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the sunlight. The horse was every bit as intimidating as its owner, standing nearly 17 hands high, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess her just as thoroughly as the man had. Morrison untied the reins and mounted with fluid grace. Then he extended his hand toward her. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Margaret replied, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She had ridden plenty back in Missouri before her family's ill-fated journey west. He pulled her up behind him, and she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch. His hands were calloused from years of hard living, but they were careful not to grip her too tightly. As soon as she settled behind him, he urged the horse forward, and they rode out of Deadwood at a steady pace. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Red rock formations jutted up from the earth like ancient sentinels, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves and the whisper of wind through the canyons. Margaret found herself studying the man who had purchased her. His shoulders were broad beneath his coat, and she could see the easy way he sat in the saddle, completely at one with his mount. Every few minutes, his head would turn slightly as he scanned the horizon, and she realized he was constantly watching for threats. This was a man who had survived in a world where survival was never guaranteed. After what felt like hours, Morrison finally spoke. "There's a cabin about 5 miles ahead. We'll stop there for the night." "What do you plan to do with me?" Margaret asked, surprised by her own boldness. Morrison was quiet for so long that she wondered if he had heard her. Finally, he said, "That depends on what you want to do." The answer was so unexpected that Margaret didn't know how to respond. In her experience, men like Morrison took what they wanted without asking permission. The fact that he seemed to care about her opinion was both confusing and oddly comforting. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the steady presence of the man in front of her created an odd sense of security. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what the next few hours might bring. The cabin Morrison had mentioned turned out to be a small but well-maintained structure nestled in a grove of pine trees beside a clear mountain stream. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Margaret could see golden light flickering in the windows. As they approached, an elderly man emerged from the doorway, a rifle cradled in his arms. "Jake!" the man called out, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Been expecting you. Got your message from the telegraph office." Morrison dismounted and helped Margaret down. "Samuel, this is Margaret. She'll be staying with us for a while." Samuel's keen eyes studied Margaret with the same intensity as Morrison's, but where Morrison's gaze was unreadable, Samuel's held warmth and understanding. "Welcome, miss. I'm Samuel Hayes, and this old cabin's been home to more than a few folks who needed a safe place to rest." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness in his voice. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with genuine warmth that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Come inside," Samuel said, gesturing toward the cabin. "I've got stew warming on the stove and coffee that'll put hair on your chest, though I reckon you might not want that particular side effect." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling at the old man's gentle humor. As they walked toward the cabin, she noticed Morrison hanging back, his eyes still scanning the darkening landscape. "He does that all the time," Samuel said quietly, following her gaze. "Man's got more enemies than a politician, but he's also got more friends than he knows what to do with. Just takes him a while to figure out which category folks belong in." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of beef stew made Margaret's stomach growl loudly. She realized she hadn't eaten since early morning, and even then it had been nothing more than stale bread and water. Samuel ladled stew into 3 bowls and set them on a rough wooden table. "Eat up, miss. You look like you could use some meat on your bones." Margaret didn't need to be told twice. The stew was the best thing she had tasted in months, rich with tender beef and vegetables that had been carefully seasoned. As she ate, she became aware of Morrison watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Why did you buy me?" she asked suddenly, the question tumbling out before she could stop herself. Morrison set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair. "Because nobody else was going to treat you right. But you don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you've been through hell, and I know you deserve better than what those men were planning for you." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Jake's got a gift for reading people, miss. He can spot a good heart from a mile away, just like he can spot a sidewinder in the grass." Margaret felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "What happens now?" "Now you decide what you want to do with your life," Morrison said. "You can stay here with Samuel as long as you need to. He's got connections throughout the territory, and he can help you find work or passage to wherever you want to go. Or," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "there's other options if you're willing to hear them." "What kind of options?" Morrison and Samuel exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation. Finally, Morrison spoke. I've got a ranch about 2 days' ride from here. It's not much to look at, but it's peaceful and safe. If you're willing to work, there's a place for you there." Margaret studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. But all she saw was a man who seemed to be offering her something she had thought was lost forever, a chance to build a life on her own terms. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Morrison nodded. "That's all I ask." As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself drawn into conversation with Samuel, who regaled her with stories of his younger days as a frontier scout. Morrison contributed little to the conversation, but she noticed the way he listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he cared about the people Samuel described. When it came time to sleep, Samuel showed Margaret to a small room with a comfortable bed and clean linens. "Jake's bedroll is by the fire," he said. "Man never sleeps in a bed if he can help it. Says it makes him soft." Margaret closed the door and sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. This morning she had been a slave, terrified of what the future might hold. Now she was in a warm cabin, her stomach full and her body clean from the wash Samuel had provided. Most importantly, she was safe. As she drifted off to sleep, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the main room. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something comforting about the sound of two old friends talking quietly by the fire. For the first time in months, Margaret O'Brien fell asleep without fear. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground like a blanket of diamonds. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment she almost believed she was back in her childhood home in Missouri. Then reality returned, along with the memory of everything that had brought her to this place. She dressed quickly and emerged from the room to find Morrison and Samuel already up and moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. Morrison looked up as she entered, and she was struck again by how different he seemed from the other men she had encountered. There was strength in him, certainly, but it was tempered by something else. Control, perhaps, or maybe just the confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. "Morning," he said simply, handing her a cup of coffee. "Thank you." The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. Samuel set a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her. "Eat up, miss. Jake's planning to show you around the area today. Let you get your bearings." Margaret looked at Morrison questioningly. "I thought you said your ranch was 2 days away." "It is," Morrison replied. "But there's other things you should see first, people you should meet." "My!" After breakfast, Morrison saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare for Margaret and his own black stallion. As they rode away from the cabin, Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride. The morning air was crisp and clean, and the landscape around them was beautiful in its rugged simplicity. Their first stop was a small homestead about an hour's ride from Samuel's cabin. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes that reminded Margaret of her own mother. "Jake Morrison," the woman said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "It's been too long." "Mary," Morrison replied, tipping his hat. "This is Margaret O'Brien. Margaret, meet Mary Patterson. She and her husband Tom run this place." Mary's expression immediately shifted to one of warm welcome. "Please come in. I'll put on some fresh coffee." The Patterson home was modest but comfortable, filled with the kind of warmth that came from genuine love and care. Tom Patterson proved to be a big, gentle man who spoke with quiet pride about the life he and Mary had built together. "Jake helped us get started here," Mary explained as they sat around the kitchen table. "We'd lost everything in Kansas, and when we came west, we had nothing but the clothes on our backs and a wagon with a broken wheel. Jake not only helped Tom fix the wagon," Tom added, "but he also helped us find this land and get established, even loaned us the money for our first seed." Margaret looked at Morrison with new eyes. This was not the cold, dangerous gunslinger she had expected. This was a man who quietly helped people rebuild their lives. "There's more folks like Tom and Mary throughout the territory," Morrison said, as they prepared to leave. "People who've had to start over, who've found ways to make honest livings despite the hardships." Their next stop was a small town called Cedar Creek, where Morrison introduced Margaret to a schoolteacher named Miss Elizabeth Hartwell. Miss Hartwell was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet strength that came from facing adversity head-on. Elizabeth came out here from Boston, Morrison explained. She's been teaching the children in this area for 3 years now. It's not always easy, Elizabeth admitted, but it's rewarding work. These children deserve the same opportunities as children back east. As they talked, Margaret found herself drawn to Elizabeth's quiet confidence. Here was a woman who had chosen to make her own way in the world, who had found purpose and meaning in helping others. There's always a need for people willing to help, Elizabeth said meaningfully, whether it's teaching, nursing, or just lending a hand where it's needed. Their final stop of the day was at a small ranch run by a Mexican family named Hernandez. Carlos Hernandez was a man in his 50s who had come north from Mexico with his wife and 3 children. Despite facing prejudice from some of the other settlers, he had managed to build a successful cattle operation. "Senor Morrison has been a good friend to us," Carlos said in accented but clear English. "When others would not deal with us, he treated us with respect. Carlos raises some of the best cattle in the territory," Morrison said. "He's an honest man, trying to provide for his family." As they rode back toward Samuel's cabin, Margaret's mind was spinning with everything she had seen and heard. Morrison had shown her a side of the frontier that she hadn't known existed, a community of people who looked out for each other, despite their different backgrounds and circumstances. "Why did you take me to meet all those people?" she asked as they rode through the gathering dusk. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Because I wanted you to see that there's more than one way to live out here. You've got choices, Margaret. You can be whoever you want to be." That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind whisper through the pines, Margaret found herself thinking about the people she had met. Mary Patterson's warm smile, Elizabeth Hartwell's quiet strength, the pride in Carlos Hernandez's voice as he talked about his family. These were people who had faced adversity and chosen to build something better. She thought about Morrison too, about the way he had been received by everyone they had visited. There had been genuine affection in their greetings, real gratitude for his help. This was not the feared gunslinger she had expected, but a man who used his reputation and his skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She found Morrison outside, tending to the horses. "I want to see your ranch," she said without preamble. Morrison looked up from adjusting his saddle. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly. "We'll leave after breakfast." The ride to Morrison's ranch took them through some of the most spectacular country Margaret had ever seen. They followed narrow mountain trails that wound through forests of pine and aspen, crossed crystal-clear streams that sang over beds of smooth stones, and climbed to high meadows where wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant colors. Morrison proved to be a thoughtful traveling companion. He seemed to know every trail, every landmark, every safe place to stop and rest. More importantly, he seemed to sense when Margaret needed encouragement and when she needed space to think. As they rode, he told her stories about the land they were passing through. He spoke of the Native American tribes who had lived here for generations, of the first white settlers who had struggled to survive in this harsh but beautiful country, of the outlaws and honest men who had shaped the territory's history. "This land has a way of testing people," he said, as they stopped to rest beside a mountain stream. "It doesn't care about your past or your plans. It only cares about who you are right now, in this moment." Margaret found herself thinking about that observation as they continued their journey. Who was she right now? She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold on an auction block in Deadwood. She was no longer the helpless victim who had been at the mercy of cruel men. She was Margaret O'Brien, and she was ready to decide her own fate. Morrison's ranch was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the rough, temporary structure she had imagined, she found a well-built log house nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. There were barns and corrals, a vegetable garden, and fields where cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It's home." Morrison replied simply. As they rode up to the house, Margaret was surprised to see smoke rising from the chimney. Morrison seemed to notice her confusion. "Rosa takes care of the place when I'm away," he explained. "She's been with me for 5 years now." Rosa turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and warm brown eyes. She greeted Morrison with obvious affection and welcomed Margaret with the same kindness Margaret had encountered from Mary Patterson. "So you are the one Jake told me about," Rosa said, studying Margaret with keen eyes. "You have been through much, see?" "Yes," Margaret replied, surprised by the directness of the question. Rosa nodded approvingly. "Good. The ones who have been through much. They understand the value of peace when they find it." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal of Rosa's excellent cooking, Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Rosa's gentle humor and Morrison's occasional dry observations. "Jake has been alone too long," Rosa said at one point, ignoring Morrison's sharp look. "A man needs more than just his guns and his horse." "Rosa," Morrison said warningly. "What? I speak only the truth. You save people, you help people, but you never let anyone help you." Margaret watched this exchange with interest. She was beginning to understand that beneath Morrison's intimidating exterior was a man who had isolated himself from the very connections that might bring him happiness. After dinner, Morrison showed Margaret around the ranch. The evening air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of hay and wildflowers. As they walked, Morrison pointed out various features of the property, but Margaret found herself more interested in studying the man beside her. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Help people like you do. What's in it for you?" Morrison stopped walking and turned to face her. In the fading light, his features were softened, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "My father was a good man," he said finally. "He taught me that strength without purpose is just violence, and that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can't defend themselves." What happened to him? "He was killed by men who took what they wanted without caring about the consequences. I was 15. Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret could hear the pain beneath the words. "I learned to fight because I had to. But I also learned that fighting isn't enough. You have to build something too." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. "Is that what this is? What you're building?" "Part of it," Morrison said, "but it's not complete. A ranch without people is just land and buildings." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I want to stay," she said, "if you'll have me." Morrison turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was completely open and unguarded. "The work is hard," he said, "and there's always danger. Men like me make enemies." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Margaret replied. "And I'm not afraid of danger either, not anymore." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then welcome home, Margaret O'Brien." As they walked back toward the house, Margaret felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She had found more than just safety and shelter. She had found a place where she could be herself, where she could contribute something meaningful, where she could be part of something larger than her own survival. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Margaret threw herself into the work of the ranch with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She helped Rosa with the cooking and cleaning, learned to tend the vegetable garden, and even began helping with the cattle under Morrison's patient instruction. Morrison proved to be a demanding but fair teacher. He expected her to work hard and to learn quickly, but he was also quick to offer encouragement when she struggled and praise when she succeeded. Margaret found herself looking forward to their daily lessons, not just because she was learning valuable skills, but because she enjoyed the quiet conversations that often accompanied their work. Rosa, meanwhile, became both mentor and friend. She taught Margaret not just the practical skills of running a household, but also the subtler arts of reading people and situations. "A woman alone in this country must be twice as smart as the men," Rosa said one day as they worked in the garden together. "But if she is, she can accomplish twice as much." Margaret's favorite time of day was the evening, when the work was done, and the three of them would sit on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Morrison would often play his guitar, filling the air with melodies that spoke of longing and loss and hope. Margaret had never heard him sing, but his playing was eloquent enough. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Margaret was surprised to see a rider approaching the ranch. Morrison immediately stood and moved to where his gun belt hung on a peg by the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly, but as the rider drew closer, Margaret could see that it was Samuel Hayes. Morrison relaxed visibly and walked out to meet his friend. "Sam," Morrison said, clasping the older man's hand, "what brings you out this way?" Samuel's expression was grim. "Trouble, Jake, the kind that follows you around like a bad smell." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had allowed herself to believe that her new life was secure, that the dangers of her past were behind her. But Samuel's words reminded her that men like Morrison always had enemies, and that safety was never guaranteed. "What kind of trouble?" Morrison asked. "Words come down from Deadwood," Samuel said. "Some of the men who were at that auction are asking questions about the girl you bought. Seems they've got ideas about taking her back." Morrison's face hardened into the stone-like mask Margaret had first seen in Deadwood. "How many?" "At least 6, maybe more. They're being led by a man named Becker. You know him?" Morrison nodded grimly. "I know him. He's bad news, Sam. The kind of man who enjoys hurting people." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had hoped that her past was behind her, but now it seemed to be catching up with her. "What do we do?" she asked. Morrison turned to look at her, and she was surprised to see not fear in his eyes, but determination. "We do what we always do. We face it head on." That night, as Margaret lay in her bed listening to the whispered conversation between Morrison and Samuel, she made a decision that would change everything. She would not be a victim again. She would not allow herself to be taken back to a life of degradation and fear. If men like Becker wanted to come for her, she would be ready. The next morning, Margaret approached Morrison as he was cleaning his guns. "I want to learn to shoot," she said. Morrison looked up, studying her face carefully. "It's not a game, Margaret. Once you pick up a gun, you might have to use it." "I know," she said, "but I won't be helpless again. I won't be anyone's victim." Morrison nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this right. No shortcuts, no half measures." For the next week, Morrison taught Margaret everything he knew about firearms. She learned to load and clean guns, to judge distances and wind conditions, to breathe properly and squeeze the trigger smoothly. Most importantly, she learned when to shoot and when not to. "A gun is a tool," Morrison explained as they practiced behind the barn. "It's not the solution to every problem, but sometimes it's the only solution that works." Margaret proved to be a natural shooter, her small hands steady and her eye keen. By the end of the week, she could hit targets at 50 yards with consistency that impressed even Morrison. "You've got good instincts," he said, as they finished their final practice session. "But remember, hitting a target is different from shooting at a person. When the time comes, you'll have to be ready for that difference." Margaret nodded, hoping she would never have to find out what that difference felt like. The attack came on a Tuesday morning as Margaret was hanging laundry behind the house. She heard Rosa scream and immediately dropped the wet sheet she was holding, reaching for the gun Morrison had insisted she carry. 6 men rode into the yard, their faces hard and their intentions clear. At their head was a man Margaret recognized from the auction in Deadwood, a heavy-set brute with cruel eyes and a scraggly beard. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "if it ain't the little lady who's been causing us so much trouble." Morrison appeared in the doorway of the barn, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "You're trespassing, Becker." Now, Morrison," Becker replied with a cold smile. "I'm just here to collect what's rightfully mine. That girl there was bought and paid for, and I got a prior claim on her." "Your claim died the moment you let her be sold," Morrison said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now get off my land." Becker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Or what? You'll gun us all down? Even you ain't fast enough to take 6 men, Morrison." Margaret could see the tension in Morrison's posture, the way his fingers flexed near his guns. She also saw Rosa crouched behind the water trough, her face pale with fear. "Let me make this simple for you," Becca continued. "Hand over the girl and we'll ride out peaceful-like. Try to be a hero and we'll take her anyway, but you'll be dead." "There's a third option," Morrison said calmly. "What's that?" "You ride out now and I let you live." Becca's face flushed with anger. "You arrogant son of a—" He never finished the sentence. Morrison's hands moved faster than Margaret's eyes could follow, and suddenly his guns were in his hands and firing. Two of Becca's men toppled from their saddles before they could clear leather. The yard erupted in chaos. Horses reared and screamed, men shouted and cursed, and gun smoke filled the air. Margaret saw Rosa running toward the house, and Morrison diving behind a water trough as bullets whined through the air around him. One of Becca's men spotted Margaret and began riding toward her, his gun raised. Margaret found herself strangely calm as she raised her own weapon and fired. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling from his horse. She turned to see Morrison engaged in a deadly dance with two of the remaining men, his gun spitting fire as he moved with fluid grace between cover points. But Becca and one other man were flanking him, and Margaret realized they were trying to get behind him. Without thinking, she ran toward the barn, firing as she went. Her shots went wide, but they were enough to distract the men and spoil their aim. Morrison used the distraction to eliminate one of his opponents, leaving only Becca and one other man standing. The final confrontation was almost anticlimactic. Becca, realizing he was outgunned and outmaneuvered, tried to use his remaining man as a shield while he retreated. But Morrison was too experienced to fall for such a trick. A single shot dropped Becca's accomplice, and a second shot sent Becca's gun flying from his hand. Becker fell to his knees, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You've made a mistake, Morrison. I got friends and they'll come for you." "They can try," Morrison replied, his voice as cold as winter wind, "but they better be faster than you were." He turned to Margaret, and she was surprised to see concern in his eyes. "Are you hurt?" Margaret looked down at herself, surprised to find that she was unhurt, despite the chaos of the past few minutes. "I'm fine." "You did good," Morrison said, and the simple words meant more to her than any elaborate praise. As they dealt with the aftermath of the attack, Margaret found herself thinking about how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a helpless victim, sold like cattle, and at the mercy of any man who wanted to claim her. Now she was a woman who could defend herself and those she cared about. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Morrison spoke the words that would define the rest of their lives together. "I love you, Margaret O'Brien," he said simply. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too, Jake Morrison, and I know exactly when it happened. It was the moment you looked at me on that auction block and saw a person worth saving instead of a thing to be used." Morrison reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "We've both been alone for too long. We don't have to be alone anymore," Margaret replied. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold as a slave, but she had been bought by a man who had given her something far more valuable than freedom. He had given her the chance to discover who she really was, to build a life based on her own choices rather than the whims of others. The frontier was still a dangerous place, and there would always be men like Becca who saw women as property to be owned and used. But Margaret O'Brien was no longer afraid. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her home. Most importantly, she had found a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession. Their love story was written in gunsmoke and starlight, forged in the crucible of the American frontier. It was a story of two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen to build something beautiful and lasting in a world that often seemed determined to tear everything down. As Morrison played his guitar under the vast western sky, Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the melody that spoke of new beginnings and endless possibilities. She had been sold as a slave, but she had been reborn as a free woman, in love with a man who would die to protect her and live to cherish her. The frontier had tested them both, and they had proven themselves worthy of the harsh beauty and infinite promise of the American West. Together, they would face whatever challenges the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, and something worth living for. Their story was just beginning, but already it was clear that it would be a story worth telling, a testament to the power of love to triumph over adversity and the ability of two people to create something greater than the sum of their individual parts. As the night deepened around them, Margaret O'Brien and Jake Morrison sat together on their porch, their hands intertwined, their hearts united, and their future stretching out before them like the endless expanse of the western sky. They had found their home, their love, and their purpose in each other, and nothing would ever be the same again.